Today we have an exciting speaker, Dr. Kouklis, who is the co-chair of this group. And she'll be talking about Alaska, extreme heat, and health.
So I'm going to talk about Alaska. I started working with FEMA during my fellowship almost 2 years ago now, and the organization has a lot of interest in learning about extreme heat and how it impacts different parts of the country. So I was kind of loosely tasked with trying to get a better understanding of heat's impacts on Alaskan natives. So this is kind of like an overview of many of the specific climate impacts and stressors that are kind of unique in the Arctic and Alaska. And yeah, I just have a couple slides at the beginning talking about heat. We all know that it's getting hotter and that's bad. There's a bunch of different ways to measure heat, and they all have good things and bad things. Heat index is just a measure of temperature and humidity, whereas the wet bulb globe temperature takes into account the cloud cover and wind and sun intensity. So they have kind of different understandings of how heat impacts people. The most commonly used one is the heat index. We all know that over the past few years, we've been seeing more and more deaths reported by the CDC directly related to heat. This is probably hugely underreported just due to the way that data is reported, like how it's recorded in medical records, and then how that is extracted in kind of epidemiologic research. And attributing a death to heat or any sort of morbidity or mortality to heat is much more complex than just this person had a heat exposure and they died from heat stroke, because of its great far-reaching impacts on respiratory illness and renal illness and cardiac illness, and also into interpersonal violence and mental health exacerbations that it impacts. This is a little bit of an overview of how things are warming. So based on NOAA data, the US is actually warming faster than the global average. On the left is a map that shows the rate of temperature change over the last century. The greatest warming is in Alaska, and the northern latitudes in general across the country are warming much faster than the southern latitudes. This is concerning because many of these areas aren't used to managing extreme heat. The maps on the right show warming relative to the average global temperature change at a global warming level of 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius, and 4 degrees Celsius. So 2 degrees is the top one, 3 degrees is the bottom left, and 4 degrees is the bottom right. And we see the US experiences exceptional warming, especially at 4 degrees C. At this global warming level of 4 degrees Celsius throughout most of the country, the mean summer temperature will increase by over 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which translates into much more frequent and prolonged heat waves. In high or very high emission scenarios, we're going to reach this top map, the 2 degrees C global warming level, in probably the next 10 to 15 years. And an aggressively controlled emission scenario can potentially avoid reaching 2 degrees C. And it is important also to note that these projections are imperfect and do not take into account all of the carbon sources, which I'll touch on a bit later. So to get into kind of the relative meaning of heat, as we all know, in medicine, your zip code has more of an impact on your health than anything else, and this holds true for heat exposure as well. There's a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research about a decade ago that found that nationwide, in cooler zip codes, so those further north in general, there is a greater increase in all-cause mortality than in warmer zip codes when temperatures rise from 70 Fahrenheit to 85 or 90 Fahrenheit. In this study, the change was attributed primarily to the presence of air conditioning in warm zip codes, which shows that infrastructure has a huge impact on health. Another study showed regional differences at which heat-related hospitalizations occurred. In the northwestern and western regions, these temperatures between 81 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit compared to 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the south and southwest. And a lot of the other regions fell somewhere in between. Both of these studies were confined to the continental United States, and the one study that was done in Alaska showed that hospitalizations started happening as low as 72 degrees Fahrenheit. This is just underlining the fact that heat is a relative experience rather than an absolute temperature impact, and it can make developing tools that can be used nationwide difficult. So let's get more into Alaska. So why do we care? The Arctic is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world. Things that we can expect to happen in the coming decades here in the lower 48 are already happening in Alaska. Beyond this, as the Arctic warms, it contributes to something called Arctic amplification, which essentially means that the warming of the Arctic leads to more rapid warming of the entire planet. This has to do primarily with the loss of reflective surfaces, such as sea ice and glaciers, and the amount of carbon that's stored in the Arctic landscape. Permafrost holds about 1,400 gigatons of carbon, which is 4 times the amount of carbon that has been emitted by humans since the Industrial Revolution, which is also the time that we started measuring anthropogenic climate change and carbon emissions. It also holds twice the amount of carbon currently contained in the atmosphere. If all this carbon were to enter the atmosphere, especially rapidly, it's unclear what exactly would happen, but we would likely see an acceleration of all the different climate-related processes that we are currently experiencing. Further, the Arctic boreal forests contain about 700 gigatons of carbon, which is just over half of the global forest carbon. I think we talk a lot about the rainforests and the Amazon as carbon sinks, but the boreal forest is just as important. And the boreal forests are at risk of becoming a carbon source rather than a carbon sink due to the increasing wildfire size and frequency in the Arctic. So if we don't pay attention to the Arctic, we probably don't really stand much of a chance of managing climate change impacts. It's also important to note that many of the climate models that have been used to predict these future scenarios, like I mentioned earlier, like the NCA assessment, don't actually take into account a lot of these sources, particularly permafrost, because we don't really understand it super well yet. And so this really huge carbon source has been completely left out of a lot of these predictions. So I want to talk about heat literally in the sense that it's getting hotter, but also in the many other manifestations beyond just like the permafrost and the boreal forests. Heat is complicating nearly all aspects of life in the Arctic and in the subarctic. These things include sea ice, permafrost, food systems. And I just want to say, like, I've never lived in Alaska. I've been there a handful of times. I'm not tough enough to live there. I was there last March and it was a whopping 18 degrees. I was wearing every single item of clothing that I had brought with me. And these people are out in their t-shirts grilling in the park. I'm not kidding here. They are very tough folks and they are very resilient. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, it's warming 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet in the Arctic. Here we see a graphic depicting the average increase in temperature in different parts of Alaska in the last 50 years. This is most pronounced at the northernmost latitudes, where the North Slope has experienced approximately a 6 degrees Fahrenheit increase over the past 50 years. This is in contrast to the continental United States, which has experienced about 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit increase over the last 50 years. If we think about heat and health, and the heat and health study mentioned earlier, we are already seeing significant negative health impacts at these current temperatures. And we can only imagine kind of the devastating health impacts if temperatures continue to increase so rapidly. For me, whenever I think of increasing heat, I always think of wildfires. These increasing temperatures have led to really increased wildfire activity in Alaska. Between 2000 and 2020, 2.5 times the number of acres were burned in the state as compared to 1980 to 2000. This increase was both due to more frequent and larger fires, and the burned area of Alaska is projected to increase between 24 and 170% by 2050. Warmer day and nighttime temperatures allowed for holdover fires and even overwintering of fires. Snowpack has decreased and the snow season is shortened by about 3 weeks. Increasing vegetation allows for both increasing amounts of fuel and fuel in new areas as permafrost thaws, which allows for previously unvegetated areas to become vegetated, or allows for a change in vegetation that can increase fuel availability. There are also more lightning strikes, which are responsible for starting many of the fires. Wildfires release many different types of particulate matter, including carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and other organic compounds, nitrogen compounds, and particulate matter. The one that we talk about the most is PM2.5, which has the ability to enter the small airways and potentially cross into the bloodstream. The larger particles can cause eye irritation and nose irritation, but have less health implications. There's also some recent literature raising concern that PM2.5 from wildfire smoke is actually more toxic than PM2.5 from ambient air, even in similar concentrations. With the increase in frequency and size of wildfires in Alaska, it's anticipated that there will be about 100% increase in wildfire-specific PM2.5 exposure by mid-century. And it was also found that Black and African American Alaskans and Alaska Athabascans, and Athabascans are one of the big indigenous populations there. These folks are already exposed to higher wildfire PM2.5 concentrations than the rest of the state. One of the great concerns with air quality in Alaska is that there is minimal on-the-ground data gathering and monitoring, and this holds true for most environmental monitoring technology. There are very few air quality monitors throughout the state. Most of them are in urban centers, which is Fairbanks and Anchorage. And this makes air quality recommendations and alerts difficult to distribute, especially in rural and remote communities where much of the native populations live. Exploring ways to both decrease wildfire smoke exposure and increase monitoring capacity would greatly benefit health. Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the Arctic. Permafrost is really cool. I had the opportunity to go into there's like a permafrost tunnel research station that's run by the Army Corps of Engineers. And I got to go inside of it. I got to see a lot of like mammoth tusks that were tens of thousands of years old. And it was just a super cool experience. But a lot of it is thawing. And permafrost thaw can lead to damage to infrastructure, including subsidence or sinking of housing and other structures due to disruption in their foundation. As you can imagine, if you have solid ground that becomes unsolid, that can cause huge amounts of damage. There can also be damage to sewage lagoons, which is one of the main ways that waste is managed in a lot of these remote communities. Roads and runways can be damaged, which can further limit transportation to and from remote communities. And traditional methods of storing food in permafrost cellars are threatened, both because they aren't keeping food cold and there's potential exposure to new infectious diseases as permafrost thaws. Permafrost thaw also contributes to more rapid coastal and riverine erosion. In some places in the state, the coast is eroding by dozens of feet per year. Flooding can also increase the rate of permafrost thaw by causing rapid warming of the frozen soil. As the permafrost thaws, previously inactive microbes begin active decomposition of organic matter, which leads to methane release. It's pretty difficult to predict the rate of methane release and the impacts that it has. However, a study in Siberia did see a significant increase in methane concentration in the summer months that was directly attributable to permafrost thaw. Methane release contributes to the phenomenon of Arctic amplification, as it is a potent greenhouse gas with 25 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. Further, methane exposure is known to exacerbate respiratory illness and has the potential to lead to cancer and birth defects. Permafrost thaw also has the potential to lead to new infectious diseases. In 2016, there was an anthrax outbreak in Siberia that was attributed to a reindeer that had been previously frozen in permafrost that thawed. 2,000 reindeer died and several people became ill from the incident. While there's potential for exposure to known illnesses, like in this example, there's also potential for exposure to new pathogens that we don't understand. There is also potential for water quality impacts and toxin exposures. Thawing permafrost can lead to rapid drainage of lakes, leading to change in stream flow, and with it, concern that waste from prior oil and gas explorations that were disposed of by drilling into the permafrost are being released into the water systems in a similar fashion. Again, there's poor water quality monitoring infrastructure. And as mentioned earlier, the vegetation patterns are changing as the permafrost thaws. This has the potential to worsen the wildfire impacts, as we talked about. There's also some concern that a change in the type of vegetation can lead to further warming and thaw in those areas, creating a positive feedback loop of worsening warming and fires. Briefly, to touch on sea ice melt, the loss of sea ice along the coast has led to greater impacts of coastal storms. These storms accelerate the already rapid coastal erosion. Storms are also becoming stronger along the coast, and in addition to the sea ice loss, this will continue to cause a larger and larger threat to coastal communities when combined with flooding and permafrost thaw. About 80% of the Alaskan population lives along the coast. Anchorage is one of the biggest population centers, and it's coastal, but then much of the rest of the rural population lives along the coast as well. Similar tactics for protection in place can be helpful when they've been used in other hurricane-prone areas. However, the risk of erosion does cause some difficulty with implementation of barriers and other infrastructure for protection. Some climatology predictions suggest that by 2050, there will be an additional ice-free winter month in both the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. Storms are occurring later in the year, coinciding with this projected ice-free month, potentially allowing for stronger or more frequent storms to impact unprotected coastline. Storm warnings and better planning for worsening erosion and flooding can help communities plan for protection in place, manage retreat, or relocation. While flooding and erosion may not have frequent direct impacts on health aside from traumatic injury in acute erosion episodes or drownings due to floods, the threat to infrastructure that may interfere with health and access to care is very real. Flooding and erosion threaten buildings, roads, runways, and trails. As mentioned earlier, there are some areas of the Alaskan coast that are eroding by dozens of feet per year, sometimes over 70 feet. Erosion often occurs quite rapidly. I mentioned this earlier. Approximately 80% of the population lives along the coast. So these are a map of the 144 most threatened communities in Alaska, and this is due to a combination of erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw. Most of these are native communities. So a few of these communities have elected to relocate. There are several methods for community relocation. Managed retreat is ideally the strategic movement of specific buildings and infrastructure within a community to safer land still within that community, where relocation is essentially picking up a town and placing it somewhere safer. Managed retreat has the benefit of maintaining cultural and ancestral connection to an area, but may not provide as complete of a protection as moving an entire community away from the threatened areas. There are many barriers in securing funding and support for relocation, even when the decision has been made. This is a non-comprehensive list of barriers to relocation. There is or was grant funding, but the cyclical nature of grants makes long-term projects difficult to complete, and there are often specific rules for use of funds. Full relocation requires funding from many agencies and coordination between different funding sources. Further, these communities seeking grant funding are often small, like several hundred people. There's staff turnover, and in most cases, a complete absence of trained professionals to apply for grant. Even those who may have experience with grant writing often have multiple responsibilities within the community. For comparison, municipal governments who are applying for similar grants have entire grant departments. Due to an extensive history of displacement, marginalization, and violence, these communities have high rates of medical illness, substance use, depression, and suicide, rendering them particularly socially overburdened. This, compounded with the isolation of these remote villages, disruption in transportation and communication, and a longstanding and understandable distrust of federal entities, further impedes their ability to obtain funding and assistance they need and deserve. Another large barrier is simply the nature of the location of many of these villages. Building a small house can cost $1 million due to the logistical costs of building materials and personnel, and that's essentially just the structure. That doesn't even include things like plumbing. Despite these many challenges and the social and emotional stress associated with relocation. So of these communities that have elected to relocate, the one that I would say has probably been most successful is the community of Newtok, which is seen here in the lower panel. Newtok is listed on the statewide threat assessment as number 7 most threatened based on the risks of permafrost thaw, flooding, and erosion. The decision to relocate was made in 1994, and they began the relocation planning process at that time. A site 9 miles away called Murtarvik was selected for relocation. In 1996, a land exchange was initiated by the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, and in 2003, Congress approved the land exchange. A literal act of Congress had to happen to even start this process. Continued accumulation of sediment from rapid erosion interferes with barge delivery of supplies for rebuilding, which slowed the process. Because the community is receiving funding for relocation, they are often ineligible for funding to improve the current site in Newtok. At this point, Murtarvik has a community center and enough housing units to allow for about half of the community to relocate. This has taken 30 years and $200 million. If you want to learn more about this, there is a film that Patagonia made called Newtok, and it is really powerful and very sad, but I highly recommend watching it if you have the time. Shishmaref in the Upper Plain is identified as the second most threatened community in the statewide threat assessment, and they have also elected to pursue relocation. The community voted on this twice, starting even earlier than Newtok. A site for relocation was selected in 2016. However, the land has not been secured as Murtarvik has for Newtok's relocation. While the planning committee is working, Shishmaref is pursuing local resilience projects, including obtaining a backup generator, improving the water supply, and conducting seawall and coastal flooding analysis, providing skills training for local community members, and focusing on improving intergovernmental relations and elevating traditional knowledge. As you can tell, both of these communities have encountered many barriers in relocation. It's very expensive and politically complex to navigate these moves, and the interaction with multiple federal agencies for funding and land further muddies the waters. Time is of the essence in these situations, and work is being done to explore how support for these communities can be accelerated. There's technical assistance available from many federal agencies to help with the grant process. However, this is just a single aspect in a multifaceted issue. This complexity is a large part in preventing other communities from pursuing relocation. However, in delaying their relocation, they may threaten their own livelihoods. Let's talk a bit more about the importance of food, because many of the health impacts of heat manifest as threats to food sources. Increasing ocean temperatures have led to harmful algal blooms, causing toxin release and food contamination. Warming has also impacted fish populations and the fishing industry. The fishing industry in Alaska provides food for much of the country, providing approximately 2/3 of the U.S. seafood harvest. In Alaska, it supports 26,000 jobs, which is about 10% of the Alaskan workforce. It provides $4.5 billion a year in wholesale value of seafood, which is a huge part of the Alaskan economy. The industry is threatened by increasing ocean temperatures, sea ice melt, marine heat waves, and ocean acidification. While there's not much to do aside from preventing further warming and acidification, bring this up mostly to underscore the fact that not only are Alaskans threatened by the physical nature of climate change threats on their health and homes, but they are at high risk of losing well-paying jobs and major sources of nutrition. This is also to underline the fact that the communities themselves are vulnerable, and so are their safety nets. Subsistence is practiced by many Alaskans, particularly in rural and remote native villages. Rural communities get 25% of their caloric intake from subsistence practices, with some getting up to 80% of their caloric intake from subsistence foods. Loss of these foods would cost about $227 to $450 million a year, which is a direct cost to the consumer. Not only does this cost a lot, but the food supply would become more vulnerable to disruptions in the supply chain than already exist. The difference between relying on food in your surrounding environment and relying on foods that have to be delivered by boat or plane. The traditional foods provided by subsistence also have a higher nutrient density. As mentioned earlier, changes in ocean temperature and acidification are changing species of fish that are available for fishing. There have been warming events in streams throughout the state that have led to massive die-offs of salmon and other fish, further impacting availability of food. With permafrost thaw and changing vegetation patterns, there's some concern that invasive species may outcompete traditional berry populations. In native communities, a scarcity of resources has led to difficulty passing down traditional knowledge from elders to the younger tribal members, which further jeopardizes the food supply from subsistence practices. This also threatens opportunities for self-determination and community resilience. Already, a review of studies from 1987 to 2019 found an overall decrease in intake of subsistence foods in native communities. Between the risk of loss of subsistence foods and the interruption of traditional food storage methods such as permafrost cellars, food security poses a great threat to the future of rural and remote Alaskan people. This burden is disproportionately borne by Alaskan natives. Lastly, I want to discuss what it means to be rural. I grew up in what I thought was a rural place, but this is on another level. When I started working in Alaska, it was pretty difficult to grasp the size of Alaska and how this impacts the remote communities. The population density is about 1% as dense of the continental United States. The remote nature of many of these communities also leave them vulnerable to infrastructure damage due to lack of redundancy in things like electrical grids or heat sources. There can be huge costs to repair and replace infrastructure, and the time to obtain resources for supplies can be extended significantly by weather impacts. There are also great threats to access to food and healthcare. Many of these communities are also geographically isolated. They don't have roads and are only accessible by air or other means of travel that are vulnerable to climate change. Much winter travel occurs over ice or permafrost via snow machines. Some groups propose a remoteness modifier to help contextualize these extra challenges for remote communities as they work to become more resilient and prepare for future challenges. Okay, so not everything is bad, even though it seems like everything is bad. Many of the communities have proven to be incredibly resilient and innovative when facing many different emerging challenges of climate change. First, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta Climate Adaptation Strategies is a comprehensive plan for the YK Delta region. It was developed and published 5 years ago. This process engaged many federal, state, and local organizations, as well as the tribes and community members. The plan is, quote, guided by approaches undertaken by Indigenous communities globally and by our own 10,000 years of experience adapting to novel sociopolitical, ecological, and technological challenges. This community-based and community-led plan provides an excellent model for others to follow. By allowing the community to lead, their greatest strengths and vulnerabilities can be best identified, uplifted, and addressed in the context of folks that are most affected. 3 focus areas were identified, each with a list of specific objectives and actions of varying degrees of priority. The first focus area was community infrastructure, the second, subsistence resources and harvest practices, and the third, trails and transportation. It included future projections of temperature, sea level rise, and precipitation for the region, then outlined a 100-year vision for the region to emphasize the importance of self-realization and self-actualization of Indigenous ways of life, and the importance of maintaining these practices for future resilience. Interestingly, despite an extensive discussion of the rapid warming occurring in the region, extreme heat was not identified as a potential threat to the 3 focus areas. Kodiak Island hosted a 2-day workshop called Adapt Kodiak. This was a smaller project than that of the YK Delta, but still engaged state, tribal, and local stakeholders. It was a 2-day conference that had 4 sessions. Each session had a speaker with opening remarks, followed by small group discussions. The 4 topics were fisheries futures, food security and subsistence, infrastructure and energy, and culture and wellness. Each session was summarized with strengths, weaknesses, and potential future actions. However, the document does not have a forward-facing plan. A similar summit was held in Southeast Alaska and Ketchikan. A great deal of discussion during the meeting was around marine and riverine water conditions and quality. There were also some concerns raised about wildfires and landslides with changes in precipitation. There is great concern regarding changes in salmon migration and notes that the migration of other animal species is also changing. Finally, there's extensive discussion about the importance of community-based monitoring and the enthusiasm of many of those in the community to engage in local environmental observation networks and the like, in collaboration with academic organizations, NGOs, federal agencies, and traditional knowledge holders. The summit was designed similarly to a co-produced adaptation planning framework from Washington State. This framework first identified climate exposures, then identified sensitivity to those exposures, and then focused on adaptive capacity of each. The summit allowed for the identification and discussion about specific climate exposures and encouraged the community to identify their vulnerability and sensitivity to each of these exposures, as well as their adaptive capacity for resilience. Finally, there was discussion about the importance of collaboration across the region and with all of the stakeholders present, including federal agencies, academicians, and NGOs, in addition to the tribes. Several tribes from Southeast Alaska, in collaboration with the federal agencies, universities, and local organizations, created a climate change adaptation plan template for Southeast Alaskan tribes. Creation of similar regional documents would allow for design of local, culturally, and historically relevant plans that are much more tangible for many more communities. The Local Environmental Observation Network, or LEOs, are a relatively common partnership found across Alaska. These networks tap into the local knowledge of a landscape and the people in these areas who have lived and worked on the land for generations. The familiarity with the landscapes helps to detect abnormal changes early on, abnormal behavior of animals, water sample collection, and other important pieces of data that many research groups don't have the resources or knowledge to collect. This information can be collected and analyzed to provide information on safety and to better track many of the changes occurring across the Arctic. This is a form of co-produced knowledge, the teaming up of Indigenous knowledge with Western science to provide a more holistic outcome and to allow for research to be done both in areas that may otherwise be neglected due to limited resources, and to ensure that research is done in a way that will include and benefit the folks that it is impacting. There are several groups that are designing models to monitor and predict permafrost thaw. This may allow for better planning for building houses, roads, and other infrastructure, and to plan for opportunities such as farming. A new satellite called the MethaneSat was released last year to monitor ground methane emissions. While its primary goal is to monitor methane emissions from oil and gas sites, similar technology in the future may allow for more granular data to monitor permafrost methane emissions. This may all seem very far from home and very overwhelming. Many of you, I imagine, face challenges in your day-to-day life already, and I think in the face of climate change, we are often met with doom and gloom more than hope. And so I just want you to take away from today that while there's a lot going on and it often feels overwhelming, there are a lot of people doing really incredible work, often outside of their own areas of expertise. None of us have the answer, but making these connections with all of these different, like the intergovernmental, interorganizational connections are probably where most of our answers lie. And there are so many people here thinking about this and working on this, and it's a great place to be. So thank you. And that's it for me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's open it up for questions.
Hey, it's Caleb. Good to see you. Great talk. When you talk to people in Alaska about heat, what is their reaction to that conversation?
It still seems pretty far from a lot of people's minds. I think that their general take is still not very hot up here. And I think that I will say in like Fairbanks, there's a little bit more connection to it and a lot of the interior, because the interior is a lot hotter than the rest of the state. The interior is essentially like a tundra desert kind of area. And so in the summer, there's still, I think, infrequently, but not unheard of days over 100 degrees, which to me, like 100 degrees in Alaska is absolute nonsense. And so I think that kind of regionally it depends a lot more. But Anchorage, I didn't really feel like there were a whole lot of folks thinking about it because it's still not hot. And I think that a lot of the discussion going forward about heat has to be not that it's temperature related, but it's like impact related. And that I think is still a novel idea.
Yeah, I really like that change in frame. I think it's important for us to not, we tend to focus on how it people focus directly on how it impacts them and makes them feel. And that might work when I was reading something that we were working on today in India when it's like super hot, but it doesn't work for a large swath of the population that actually have huge impacts and huge influence. You know, maybe you can speak a little bit more about how you think we could reframe that conversation or how we should reframe that conversation.
I think a lot of that has to do with like pulling regional data and like looking directly. And it's hard, right? Because how are we actually capturing all of the health impacts of heat when we don't have ways of recording it in the medical record in a way that's intelligible or even like present? But looking at like the regional impacts and seeing like, oh, at this temperature, we're actually starting to see changes in hospitalizations and death. Whereas I think a lot of people look at a specific temperature. Like, for example, FEMA is using the definition of heat as 95 degrees for 3 days. And I'm like, that doesn't work. No one in Arizona cares if it's 95 degrees for 3 days. And everyone in Seattle cares if it's 95 for 3 days. And so I think that there has to be this like real focus on local data and local impacts. And it's hard to kind of identify like how big of an area you're talking about is local, even because even within a state, there's so many different climates. And so I don't know how to like really structure that conversation aside from saying like we know on a pretty large scale that we see these different impacts in different regions. And so we have to get down to the more granular data to understand how in our region we're actually seeing those changes.
One thing that seems to capture a lot of people's attention in the California specifically and in the West, it has been the wildfires, right? Whereas heat, people like, well, I can turn on my air conditioner. Like the wildfires, they see it, they feel it, they read these stories about it, they worry about their home insurance. It like, even if it's less of an actual direct impact on most people, they seem to accept it more as a direct thing that could impact them. And maybe it is impacting them financially and from a respiratory standpoint and other things like that.
And yeah, I think that's also a good thought, is to include these other impacts of heat. And if you're talking about air conditioning, nowhere in Seattle has air conditioning. And so even that is like a conversation to have. I think a lot of like the northern part of the country doesn't have air conditioning because historically we've never needed it. Whereas like the southern part of the country, everyone has air conditioning or swamp coolers or something like that because historically it's been really important. Even drawing attention to things like, do you wish you had air conditioning last summer? Yes or no? Is, I think, a similarly like tangible thing that people can relate to. And then you can get into like, if you want to talk about wildfires too, you can also get into like, do you feel like you need a HEPA filter for your house? What are the other things that you need to think about when you're thinking about all of these impacts surrounding just heat? Yeah, cost is super important. I think a lot of this is just going to be like a financial bottom line. I actually saw a really interesting clip of someone, she's a climate scientist, and her dad was pretty conservative, and she was talking about the thing that finally convinced her dad that climate change was real. And it was that all the insurance companies hired climatologists and were using those future predictions to decide whether or not they were going to provide insurance in places or like the cost of insurance. And that was the thing that he was like, oh, if these huge companies, all of them have leaned into this, and there's not like some other company that's coming in and undercutting the entire market, then there has to be something there. And so I think that appeals to a lot of people just because it feels oddly more impactful than a lot of other things.
I agree with that. I think that in the Florida around floods and hurricanes and stuff and the difficulty people are having insuring their properties. And now you're seeing that in California, right? There's been a huge shift, I think, in the last couple of years around willingness to insure for fire, right? Including it either as needs to be a separate policy or it not available at all. And that starts to freak people out when they like know people that whose homes burned down, they can't rebuild. FEMA's only getting stripped more and slower. And then they're sitting there and they're like, can't insure their home. At least you can't afford to insure your home because it's going to end up Florida expensive eventually. I do agree that's one of the very key touch points for them.
Yeah, you obviously have a lot of experience in this space. What do you think is some of the most important things that emergency medicine physicians can do to try to like combat this?
What are we combating?
Like the climate crisis and environmental injustice. Many of us are far away from Alaska, but what are some tangible things we can do, like at our own institution?
I think just having the conversation a lot of the time is really important. Like, how do you engage with the people that you work with? How do you engage with your patients? I think those conversations, like, especially with our patients, I feel like they actually really value our opinion. And if you look at George Mason University, there's like tons of data on this, right? They're like, especially as you get further right in people's beliefs, the people actually really believe their doctors. I think the like for most conservative section of people that they surveyed for that study, like your family physician was one of the top 5 people that you believed on climate change. And so just like if someone comes in on a day and you think that what they're there for is related to the climate, have that conversation. Like, oh, like you're here with an asthma exacerbation. It's smoky outside. Did you go outside today? Do you know that's bad for you? And this is like probably what caused it. And that further provides them with some amount of their own knowledge to protect their own health going forward. And maybe they won't hear it from you that day. Maybe they won't hear like climate change is real from you that day. But like continuing to have these conversations with folks, I think is really impactful, and doing it in a way that's like non-accusatory and non-judgmental. And depending on where you're working and who your patient is, not even saying things like climate change, but connecting their presentation in the ER to what is happening outside. I think that can be really meaningful just because it brings in some awareness to what's going on. And then the other thing is just like do the things that you like. Like, I think that's really important. There's so many things that we can do. Like for me, healthcare sustainability theoretically is very important. And I have a hard time personally getting really excited about it. And so trying to do something like that is like, I'll probably do it at some point because I can get paid for it. But I'm not like chomping at the bit to do life cycle assessments or waste audits or something like that. And that's just like a personal interest thing. And so to really, I think, be effective is just to figure out the little circle of what you're good at, what you love, and what you can get paid for. And in the middle is like that thing. It's like, how do you find that Venn diagram piece? And I think that is really helpful in making this like a sustainable thing going forward, because there's so much to do and it's so easy to get pulled into so many things and be overwhelmed by that. So I think just checking in with yourself and doing things that you actually really care about, or at least can get paid for if you don't super duper care about it, can be really helpful.